Welcome to Lead Pods, the official leadership podcast from USMB for pastors and church leaders, where our goal is to increase our impact together.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to episode 74 of the USMB Lead Pods. As always, I'm really grateful to be your host today. My name is Matt Erzman, and we've got a really great episode I'm looking forward to sharing with you about a topic that is unfortunately pretty evergreen, something that all of us have to deal with from time to time in ministry, and that's just how to avoid burnout, how to stay healthy, how to set up boundaries that protect you and your family and your church. This is just something that every pastor, every church leader just unfortunately has to wrestle with. Ministry is really hard, in case you didn't know, and there's just a lot of pressure, a lot of weight that typically falls on pastors, really at all levels, like lead pastors definitely, but every other leader on staff has a lot of these similar struggles that come with just being in full-time ministry or even part-time ministry or lay ministry. So today I'm honored to be speaking with Bill Clem. Bill is the director of the Center for Pastoral Flourishing, which is part of Western Seminary out in Portland. So this is his job. This is his main gig, is just making sure that pastors stay healthy and that they're able to have a healthy and flourishing ministry. And Bill's a great guy to do it. He has decades of pastoral leadership. He's been a church planter, various roles in various churches. He actually, for a long time, was a pastor at Mars Hill Church in Seattle. Many of you probably know some of the amazingly fruitful things that came out of that church and some of the pretty painful things that came out of that church. So Bill's background really is pretty perfectly aligned for him to be someone who's kind of leading the charge on making sure that pastors stay healthy. So the time I had with Bill was great. I think you'll be able to sense he just has that pastor's heart where he just truly wants all of us to have successful ministries without compromising our own health or our own families. So like I said, unfortunately, it's very timely. We all need to figure this out. I think you'll be encouraged by some of the tips and the resources that Bill shares with us today. So as always, let's take a quick break to hear from a sponsor. We'll get to a really great conversation with Bill Clem.
The National Pastors Orientation is coming to beautiful San Diego April 17th through the 19th, 2023. This event, sponsored by the USMB Board of Faith and Life, is for lead or staff pastors new to the pastorate or new to the USMB family. Spouses are also strongly encouraged to attend. The NPO offers an excellent opportunity for new pastors to learn about MB family history, theology, and resources. This time spent with leaders and other pastors in our national and district families will provide encouragement and networking opportunities, as well as an opportunity to be renewed, refreshed, and have a little fun. For more information, visit www.usmb.org/NPO2023.
All right, my friends. Well, today I'm excited to introduce you to a new friend of the USMB family. Today we're joined by Bill Clem. He's got a really interesting story and a lot of good experience that I think is going to be really beneficial to all of us today. So Bill, thank you so much for joining us today. Glad to have you with us on the podcast.
Oh, well, thanks. Man. It's my pleasure to be here.
So now you've been involved with some webinars, a couple kind of ancillary things in the USMB world. So if people haven't had a chance to meet you yet, can you just share a little bit about yourself, your how you came to faith, your story, getting to know Jesus, wherever you want to take that. Help us get to know you a bit.
Okay. So I grew up in a blended family. What I mean by that is that my mom was a Christian, my dad wasn't, And so being a male, being imprinted by the dominant male in my home, I wasn't convinced that Christianity was a guy thing, So it took a while, but I went to a camp every summer. And when I was about 11, I prayed to receive Christ at a summer camp. And then I continued to go there each summer. It was almost like my cycle, I'd have my mountaintop experience and carnal on down for the year and then rev back up and carnal on down. So I'm sure there are a lot of people that live that cycle, but I'm grateful for the camp. In fact, when I graduated from high school, I went to Bible college and I came back and worked at the camp each summer as a counselor. I met my wife there and we directed the camp for a couple of years as married people. So it was a very meaningful time in our life in input. I've been in some form of ministry, from being in a camping world to teaching in a seminary to being a church planter to being a youth pastor for the last 47 years. And, there comes a time where that's no longer a credibility issue because you're going, you must be completely culturally irrelevant.
No, not at all.
So I feel like the older I get, the less I really can speak into culture, but the more I do understand, I think, the nature of God and the nature of the human condition. And so I feel like if I can get some docents along the way to interpret it culturally, I can still have a voice.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think what we're going to spend most of our time talking about right now is you're currently the director of the Center for Pastoral Flourishing at Western Seminary in Portland. So I love the title of that. Can you tell us what exactly is that, and how did you get started with that?
Yeah, I would love to. Sometimes I think it should be the Center for Hoping Pastors Will Flourish,
Yeah, right.
But basically, I'm a alumnus of the school, and I was on staff at a church in Portland called Imago Dei Community Church. And while I was there, I was an adjunct faculty for about 5 years at Western. And Western got a grant to start the Center for Pastoral Flourishing. And so a couple of my friends that were profs said, hey, you'd be the right guy for it. So I applied for it, and they asked me to come and direct it. And so I started in that in January, just as COVID rolled in. So it wasn't a great start when one of your primary delivery systems is retreats,
Nice.
So I got 2 retreats in 2 different cohorts, 1 retreat with 1 cohort, and then 3 or 4 that just tried. And then we all had to go virtual. And I felt like the ones that had a face-to-face to begin with, they made it. And the ones that were virtual just kind of, never really bonded. So I felt like they got more of a curriculum than they did a flourishing igniting, because what I try and tell the people that go into a cohort is you don't have to be best friends the rest of your life. What we're here to learn is the skill of being a best friend, someone that can with you in the trouble you're experiencing and rejoice with you when you've got a high spot, and that we can borrow one another's that way. When I'm in a low spot, I can rejoice with you and you can bear my burden. And when you're in a low spot, I can bear that and you can rejoice with me, So that's part of what I'm trying to help people learn is the importance of a peer partner, The research that we kind of based our proposal on to the grant it came out of a study that Covenant Seminary did. And it was, called Resilient Ministry. And they came up with 5 qualities of a resilient pastor. So he was practicing spiritual formation, self-care, had some awareness of emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence. We addressed family and then leadership. So those were the 5 big buckets, Yeah, and I started just doing that, just doing a retreat on each one of those 5, going, okay, I can knock this out. And I realized that if I had 10 guys in a cohort, there were 2 or 3 that weren't interested in one of those topics, And so they're just enduring a retreat. So then we started messing with, are there some bigger topics that address all 5 of those issues, So then we kind of went to identity, because that kind of goes around all of them, if you are not spiritually forming, you've got a stagnant identity, so it addresses a lot of those topics. And then discernment was another one of those that dips into the whole idea of EQ and leadership. And then the third one was building a leadership culture, which addresses leadership, but it also takes in the relational components, So those have been our 3 big retreats that we kind of do, or cohort topics that we do now, And my favorite delivery system is still through a retreat format, but I've had to, embrace Zoom and say we can do some virtually. And as long as people are really willing to live it out, it works. But when it's only a 2-hour a month thing, then it falls pretty flat,
Yeah, I get that for sure. So you've had obviously a lot of ministry experience, and just the few minutes I've had with you, we chatted just briefly before we started recording. I can just tell this is something you're really passionate about, and you've got a lot of experience to back it up. So let's kind of back up. We'll dive a little bit deeper in a minute, but pastoral flourishing, like why is this something that you care a lot about? And do you feel like it's needed now more now than it has been before? Like, I'd just love to hear your heart behind why is this so important?
Well, I do think that there's a pervasive edginess, almost an anxiety in our culture, you know what I mean? And so I think everyone's on edge about flourishing, not just pastors. So I think it's a cultural dimension as well as a pastoral one. Personally, my life got radically rattled when my wife of 31 years died, and the passage of scripture that became life-giving to me was the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks about the wise man, the foolish man, because I was a typical American who read that as, if I'm a wise man and I build my life on Christ, I won't have winds, rain, or floods, That's not what the passage says at all. It says, no, you're going to have them. So Jesus is saying, I'm not making a crisis-free life. I'm making a crisis-proof life. And so that's to me what flourishing is helping somebody have enough resilience and enough depth to their life that in a good time, that's pretty easy, except that we have a tendency to take the credit ourselves, right? Yeah. I mean, I've heard it said that people are the only mammals that if you tap them on, pat them on the back, their head swells up. And so, when we do well, we get an attaboy, we start to think, hey, I did it, Yeah. So even in those, helping somebody graciously say, I'm so grateful God partnered with me in this, but I give him all the glory. And in the ugly moments too, to be able to say, I'm so grateful God went through it with me and I give him all the glory, Yeah. I mean, that's what I love about the idea that you've got a Jesus who feeds 5,000 and you got a Jesus who's alone on Mount Calvary.
You just mentioned that our culture's in this time where I think a lot of people are feeling worn out, anxious, stressed. But I think it's also true that there's kind of an extra dose of that in ministry, maybe especially if you're a lead pastor. We've got people of, a lot of different ranges of leadership listening. Maybe if people aren't in that one of the kind of first chairs of leadership at a church, what are some of the things that, church planners, lead pastors, or even just people who've been in ministry for a long time, how does that affect you differently than just, like you mentioned, everyone's kind of feeling some stress right now? What are some kind of unique pressures that pastors are feeling?
Well, I think that pastors in a lot of ways are cultural architects, right? They're supposed to create a culture that hopefully is a counterculture to hearing all the angst. And now all of a sudden you're in a place where we're going to know the peace of Christ. Okay. Yeah. And it's overwhelming to try and create that culture when the people you're trying to create that culture with bring the other culture with them. And if you say something about a cultural issue, you've got half your people that say you said too much and half that say you didn't say enough, or you said the wrong thing. Right. And all of a sudden you go, well, the safest role then for me is to do the turtle move and put my head back in the shell and not stretch my neck out there to get it chopped off, Yeah. And so I think that's a big challenge is, are you willing to take an undeserved shot, And I think that after you've had a few of those, you almost get gun shy rather than say, breathe.
Yeah. We probably don't need to convince people too much. The pastors are under a lot of stress. I think our audience is pretty familiar with that. But well, I mentioned at the top here that you recently, I think last year, you did a couple webinars for us for our kind of our UB leaders. And so if people weren't able to tune into those, can you give just a quick recap? What kinds of things were you telling us at those webinars?
So like I mentioned, one of the 5 qualities that we're looking for in a resilient pastor is emotional intelligence. So I did dive into that quite a bit. I gave several examples of what your EQ would manifest itself like if you were low, different things like a lack of sensibility to how you affect others with your work, taking on a victim mentality, maybe even the idea that you would get defensive whenever you're challenged, and who doesn't in some ways, but if you're saying, wow, there are ways in which I have made myself unapproachable. Okay. That's a low EQ. Mm-hmm. On the other flip side, what's a high EQ? You're looking for win-wins. You're looking for the idea that someone else can be empowered, that you're happy when it's a team effort rather than you're just the lone wolf, So those were some of the things so I give an EQ assessment and there are all kinds of them out there from free to, $5,000. But one of the, they measure some things. So a lot of times people will have an idea of a low point in their life. Let's just say, for example, somebody is very high in independence. Okay. And very low in empathy. Okay. Yep. There's a lone ranger. And they don't even know it because they're not sensing where the other person's at. Okay. Yep. But it's very helpful if you were to become aware of how you assessed yourself with this mirror of an assessment tool to look at that and go, okay, I need to start asking people what they think rather than assuming I know what they think.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And those little stutter stats make all the difference in the world.
And I guess, I haven't studied this. So I don't really know nearly as much as you do, but let me back up just a little bit. You mentioned, COVID, obviously it was a a hard time for pastors for sure, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people had to overnight shift everything, right? And then it seems like ever since then, ever since March of 2020, there's been a pretty steady stream. You just mentioned all the cultural issues, the political stuff. I mean, pretty much there hasn't really been a tranquil time since then,
Yeah.
right? So for people who are in leadership, it's pretty much been one difficult season after another. So I guess what I was going to say is, are there things that you recommend that all of us should do no matter what our EQ scores are, or is the first step doing some of these kind of analysis type things? Or are there some
no, I think, the more we can become aware, the better,
Yeah.
I think some people misquote John Calvin, but John Calvin did say that, the two big things you got to know are God and yourself. And so I think that's important. If I was going to say, what's the big E on the eye chart for all of us, I'd say it's that we work out of a spirit of fear, and so let's just say, for example, well, I can tell you, I remarried and my wife and I weren't getting along as well as I thought we should. And I said, let's go to counseling. She goes, why don't you go? Okay. So I did.
Yeah.
And I get to this counselor and he goes, how can I help you? I go, well, I need you to help me with my anger. And he goes, I can't really do this, but if I could, I would bet you $500 that by our third session, you don't think you have an anger problem. Of course, that made me mad.
And you asked for your $500, right?
Yeah. So, about either the end of 2 or the beginning of the third session, he said, well, anger is a secondary emotion. And that was like revelation to me. And I go, what are you talking about? Because there's an emotion behind that that's tripping your anger. And when we got there, it was fear,
Yeah.
And so then I could go, rather than going, what's making me mad? I could go, why am I feeling threatened right now? And as a believer, when we can start realizing I'm being threatened because they're criticizing my work and I'm getting my identity from my work. I need an identity shift to getting my identity in Christ,
Yeah. Man, that's huge. And I think, again, I want to be careful about overstating that, but I think that's probably something that all of us feel, right? Like the whole anger, but what's really behind the anger? Can you just talk about that some more? Like, do you think, is that probably true for everybody, or what else did you learn when you were kind of wrestling with that?
Yeah. No, I do think that, anger is such a controlling fear, or a controlling emotion. I was just at the store last week with my wife and I was upset at everybody, how they were parking and driving. And everything. She said, do you like being mad? And I had to stop for a minute and go, I do like the rush. I do like the power feeling of it. I don't like the residual. I don't like, all the broken things that I got to go mop up afterwards, but I become addicted to that adrenaline, And so I do think it's important for us to even be aware of that. I mean, so I'll just tell you, because you'd asked me before, I was involved with Mars Hill. Okay. And I was the lead pastor at the Ballard campus, which was the main campus for most of the time. And I would say that well over half of our staff went to a naturopath every week and had an IV drip of vitamin B, because we were trying to replenish our adrenal glands that we depleted our adrenal levels to a place that, we were burned out. And rather than figuring out a way to live not burning out, we tried to figure out how can we juice the burnout,
I wasn't sure how much you wanted to talk about, Marcel. We can talk about it maybe just a little bit, but
yeah.
You just mentioned the burned out language, which again, I think that's pretty common language. A lot of pastors, I think, are facing burnout, and even just feeling depleted, feeling tired. I guess that's the other thing that maybe we should talk about a little bit is we're all tired to different degrees. We're all stressed to a different degree. We're never going to alleviate those kinds of things. So how, in your experience, how did you know when it was past what's normal for a leader to feel, right? How do we know if we're just tired? Are we depleted? Are we needing medical attention? How do you know where you're at on that scale?
Well, okay. So for me, it was like, I'm ramping up to where I'm probably living on red line and I don't know it. Okay.
Yeah, right.
And then all of a sudden you get asked to do one more thing.
Yeah.
And when you do that one more thing, something either drops or something, you explode in a way you don't want to explode. It can be a bunch of different ways that it kind of leaks out. We're just not strapped tight. So strap leaks out. And
Right.
so as we're, kind of in some kind of eruptive state, and then we start realizing, okay, I've got to put some kind of stimulant in me, whether that's a Red Bull, or I've got to figure out some kind of detach mode, whether that's a binge at Netflix or whatever it is. Those are basically just medication, and one of the things that, I like a lot of what Brene Brown says. And one of the things that I like that she talks about is when she has quit since, but she said, there was a time in her life where she numbed, and one of the ways she numbed was with alcohol.
Mhm.
And so she just wanted to numb her stress. But what she realized is that most of our numbing techniques, whether it's alcohol or whether it's Netflix or whether it's aggressive exercise, okay, that we want them to be like a local anesthetic that just numbs that pain, but they're general anesthetics and they numb us to everything, and I found that when I just take something as seemingly innocuous as binging a series on Netflix, I found that it just dulled me to sensitivities of like promptings of the Holy Spirit, that wasn't a numbing I wanted. And so I started realizing I'd rather take the stress and figure out how to get rid of it than I would rather figure out how to cope with it and get numb to everything else.
Yeah. Right.
And I think that one of the things that this is I think a hazard for pastors is that we have in our heads what it takes to be a Christ follower. Okay. So we have in our heads, that's going to take you being in the Word of God. It's going to take you talking to God in prayer. It's going to take you living with the people of God in community. Let's just take those three. Okay.
Sure. Okay.
And if I'm the preaching pastor, if I'm not careful, I'm in the Word every day just to prepare my message,
Sure.
And so that kind of gets put on the shelf as far as a personal agenda. And now that's one of my roles as my job. Okay.
Yep.
Second one, if I'm looking at the idea of prayer, and I'm in a couple of prayer meetings during the week, whether that's staff and whether it's the congregation or, whatever it happens to be. So then that becomes part of my job. And then looking at the whole idea of community, well, I have a staff or I have these department heads that I meet with, or I'm the youth pastor, I meet with my youth team, or I'm the worship leader, meet with my worship team. That's my community. And all of a sudden you have what's, I call it the great exception, that pastors are given the exception clause, the very things that they're trying to invite people to grow in their faith.
Yeah.
And, and then we wonder why faith is anemic because we are kind of, it's almost like, we're just taking supplements rather than real food.
Right. And I know, I'm guessing you've seen this in your experience too. Like there are some healthy leaders, healthy pastors who are very busy and they're able to do a lot and they're healthy. There are some people who do a lot and they're unhealthy. And then there's some people who, like, just to be honest, they're not as busy and they're not healthy. Right. So I don't know if our activity level is necessarily an indicator of how healthy we are necessarily. Right. So
right.
A while ago, you were talking about identity. I'm guessing that's part of this, right? Like you mentioned, if your identity is, I'm a good pastor, I'm a good whatever, maybe that weight starts to add up, right? So it's not like you can be busy and healthy, right? Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah. So in that EQ assessment, for example, the top score that we're looking at is called self-regard. Okay. The next one down is called self-actualization. Right. Now, there's all kinds of ways we can describe that, but just in terms of, and for the sake of a pastor, let's look at that as self-regard is who you see yourself as, and self-actualization is who you see yourself as a pastor. Okay. When I give that test, I'd given that assessment to probably 130 pastors by now. Okay. And I'm seeing well over 80% are way lower in their self-regard than they are in their self-actualization, which means they're ministering out of their position rather than out of their person,
Okay.
And that allows for all kinds of gaps. You give yourself permission to not have to live up to the very things you're preaching because, I'm preaching out of my position, not out of my person.
Right. Right. So I could see how that'd be like these kind of things I think happen really naturally, right? Especially if you're a person who has a high level of EQ, if you really care about people, which hopefully a lot of our pastors do, right? like it's easy for your task list to just continually snowball. If you're the kind of person who cares, someone wants to start a new ministry, you care about that person. It's a good idea. Sure. Why not? You have a hospital visit. Yeah, I should probably do that. So what, this is maybe impossible, but what can churches do? So maybe if it's a lead pastor, or maybe there's an elder or deacon who's listening, if they're kind of on the top level of leadership, what kinds of things can we do to help guardrail these kinds of things?
Probably, I mean, in one sense, there's a DNA problem, right? The DNA problem is that the pastor does a ministry. And in Ephesians 4, it says the pastor equips the saints to do the ministry.
Yeah, that's
and
important.
so as long as the congregation thinks they're the audience and the pastor is the player on the field, rather than he's the coach and they're the players on the field, we've got a problem.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Right.
And so, but I don't think that it's going to occur to them. That is part of what the pastor does, is lead his church to see, to in a sense, have an identity in himself of, I am a minister.
Yeah.
I am a missionary. It's not the pastor's job to lead people to Christ. It's not the pastor's job to grow people in Christ. It's the pastor's job to equip me to know how to lead my friends to Christ and to grow my family in Christ,
Yeah.
So that's a big deal,
Yep.
What can the church do? I think I like a lot of what Pete Scazzaro has written. And one of the things that he's written that I really like is when he says we need to learn to live with our limits, And so the average church is looking for somebody that can do it all, right?
Right.
And it's funny. I when I hit about 55, I was still getting calls from churches, but rather than them saying, "Hey, would you consider being our pastor?" the calls started to come more like, "Hey, do you have any references for pastors?" Because I kind of hit the ceiling. They weren't looking for anybody my age anymore, but they wanted somebody with my experience, which is really funny. If we could find 40 years of experience in a 30-year-old guy, we've got to win.
Right.
So I think that being able to embrace your limits, both as a church and as a congregation and as a pastor, I think are huge. Like just since January, I've been doing an interim pastorate about 9 miles away from me in a community that doesn't even have 1,000 people in it. And I live in an agricultural valley, so it's predominantly fruit packing plant and some workers that come in seasonally. Okay. If that church is frustrated that they're not going to be 500, they're going to be frustrated forever because there's only 1,000 people in the community. You know what I mean?
Right.
So embracing the limit of what does a robust community of Christ look like at 50 to 70 people will serve them well, rather than looking around and seeing, oh man, we need a worship pastor, a children's pastor, and comparing themselves to some big urban center. It's just not going to work. And so I think embracing limits all the way around it. And again, I think that's a DNA lead type thing where the pastor isn't expecting everybody to do everything and they're not expecting the pastor to do everything.
Sure.
The other part of that kind of, I think, handshakes with it is that I'm not only not expected to do everything, but we actually start to realize that there are people that are better at things than me,
Yeah.
So if you're a perfectionistic pastor, a lot of times you don't want to hand off because it won't go as well,
Right.
Right. I like to make my own slides for PowerPoint. And so whenever it happens to be, you just don't want to trust that little nuanced thing because it would be a 7 instead of a 9. Okay.
Right.
And you just have to say, is a 7 adequate for what we want to do? Or do we have to have it be a 9 every time?
Yeah.
I think there were times where, I think Paul, when Paul is on Mars Hill, says that not many people believed. And I think he went right from there to Corinth. And when you look at how he starts Corinth, he says, I purpose to know nothing among you except Christ. Because his last time he tried to do it with the cultural apologetic, I don't think he's saying one wasn't right. I think he's just saying, I'm going to be here longer than the day. So I'm going to go with an incarnational presence rather than a confrontational presence,
Interesting. Yeah. That's interesting. So you were at Mars Hill at a very large church, and then you just mentioned you're in a pretty small community right now.
Yeah.
I know. So I'm not a pastor necessarily, but I guess it makes sense to me that there's always been this pressure to do more, right? To start a new ministry, to grow your church. Like right now, USMB, we're in this season where we're really passionate about planting new churches, right? That's one of our core things, is to plant new churches. if you look at the numbers, there's a need for more churches, right? So I guess I was curious, how do you balance that, especially if someone by nature is a pretty ambitious person, they've got big dreams, big goals. How do you balance that with what you were just talking about knowing your limits? Because both are healthy, right? Like we should set goals. We should plant churches. We should tell more people about Jesus. But if we do it, if the extremes get too out of whack, we start destroying ourselves, right? So how have you come to terms with that balance?
That's good. There are times where I've been in a ministry that would have required me to overdrive my headlights to run it by myself, and I needed to have a team. And there are times where I've been in a ministry that, for lack of a better term, let's just say it was a 4-cylinder demand on an 8-cylinder guy. Okay.
Yeah.
And so at that point, you take the other 4 cylinders, I think, and you figure out what else is it that you can serve the body or the world with, right? So whether it's something you do in your community, or for me, it was teaching part-time at a seminary,
Okay. Yeah. The one thing that was also on my list to ask you about, which I know this is kind of a stereotype a little bit, but like if a pastor is especially if they're in a season or a church where they are just overloaded, they're depleted possibly, one of our first questions is like, how's their marriage? How's their family? Right. And that's just one thing that I know we all struggle with, is to stay invested in our marriages, stay invested in our families. And do you have any advice for that? How do we make sure that our families stay a high priority in the midst of all this? Do you have any advice for that?
It's a delicate balance. So on one side, I want to say your family needs to be involved as a ministry. And the other side, there needs to be a boundary where there's actually a family and not a ministry,
Right.
And both of those have to be there. So like when I was a youth pastor, I did a lot of speaking at camps and different things, and so my wife and I sat down and said, how many days a year can I be out without damage to the family? Okay.
Yeah.
And for us, we said that was 80 days. Okay.
Right.
So as long as somebody called and I was in my 80-day window, I could say yes without having to do a family powwow,
Yeah.
But when we start broaching that, then I needed to come to the team, which was 4 kids and a wife, and say, okay, this camp's asked me to come speak at this. What did that look like for us? Mm-hmm. And sometimes it'd be, well, what does the camp have for us? And they'll go and play as kids, or at other times it was, what's the honorarium so that we can go on a family vacation or something like that, or if it was, we just want you home that week, those are things that I think are important to have a dialogue about, rather than just, minister gets thrown at the family and they have to, just brace for it and let it, I think another part of that really is, so when I was in my ordination council, I was probably, I'm grateful that they let me get ordained. But like I had one guy say, what are your spiritual gifts? And I said, well, I have 5 of them. I said, 5? Really? What are they? I said, well, it's Janie, Chrissy, Billy, Johnny, and Jenny, and I just named my wife for my 4 kids because they are my gifts. And so I need to practice my gifts.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And I guess a big part of this too, we haven't really touched on yet, is just awareness, right? Like maybe for you, if you're the husband, the dad of the house, maybe for you think you're okay with 120 days away or whatever, but your wife says, no, what about 60? And you just talk because that self-awareness piece is so important, right? Or maybe it's a different aspect of ministry that we're not really aware of our own, how drained we might actually be. So that goes back to the EQ thing, right? So maybe if someone's kind of teeter-tottering, like they feel like they're okay most days, but then they have days where they're really struggling. Can you just talk about that? How can we get to know ourselves better so we know when we're actually on the tipping point there?
I do think some kind of assessment, whether it's an EQ assessment or whether it's a leadership assessment or whether it's a Myers-Briggs or a DISC or whatever. And I'm sure most pastors have had to take one, and they probably use one in premarital, right?
Yeah.
So as we kind of look at the different instruments, how we relate to others, I think it's important that we take some kind of tool rather than just think that we're going to get an accurate read all by ourselves. Because, Jeremiah tells us our hearts are desperately wicked and we'll deceive ourselves in a minute, right?
Yep.
I can handle this. I think the other part, like Gary Chapman wrote that book years ago on 5 love languages. Okay.
Yep.
I think it's important to know the love languages of your kids and your wife. And if you've got time spent with family members, you don't have as much time discretionary to be out because
Right.
that's their level, you know?
Right.
I remember one time we went on a family vacation to Disneyland and we were gone about 11 days. I was a youth pastor in Seattle. I'm going, man, I'm tired. I'm ready to go back to work, you know?
Yeah.
And my youngest son, he's a one-on-one individual. Time spent with is his love language. In fact, he owns a motorcycle and we go usually on a 10-day motorcycle trip every summer together. So he gets his one-on-one time. But we were on our like 8th or 9th day and he goes, hey, Dad, when are we going to get some time together? And, are you kidding me? You're getting all this time. But to him, it wasn't personal, you know?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So you need to realize that your audience determines your love language more than you do.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Well, that's a good segue, because one of my next questions was, if someone listening isn't necessarily, if they're not on staff or there may be a lay leader, speaking of audiences, how can our churches help our pastors? If someone listening, whether they may or may not know the depths of how healthy their pastor is, I don't know, but how can we better support our leaders as a congregation member?
So I think some of that has been the whole idea of, you know, like we were just talking, making sure that you don't have these expectations that he's got to do everything. It doesn't have to be the guy that opens the church, closes the church, you know. And yet I do understand, especially more ministering to this little church in this little community, you know, that I do have a key and I do open the door for prayer meeting on Wednesday nights, you know.
Yeah.
And it's just part of the nature of what it is. And yet at the same time, they know that I have a job and that, you know, they give me grace in not responding immediately to an email or something, that it'll be in my slot for them. And so I think for churches and pastors to figure out what's going to be our rhythm is a critical thing.
Okay.
If a pastor, you know, has a day that he's going to Sabbath, and I'm calling it that rather than a day off. If he has a day where he's going to Sabbath, the church really needs to help him protect it. You know?
Is there a way that those of us on staffs can gently remind our congregations of that? How does that practically play out?
Well, okay. So, I mean, here's the weird thing. So I was at church where I was in the green room before I was going to speak. And I heard the worship pastor just reaming out the worship band for transitions and, you know, how they sounded and let's go here or there and do it again. You know, and I had a one-on-one with them regularly on Thursdays. And so when our one-on-one came about, I said to him, hey, do you Sabbath? He goes, yeah. I go, when's your Sabbath? He goes, Fridays. I go, so all day, you know, he goes, Friday night through all day Saturday is my Sabbath. I'm like, okay, that's good. And he said, so do you do any work on those? He goes, I try not to. And I said, okay, so let me ask you a question. When do you think the people on your worship team Sabbath is? He's crying. He goes, I guess it'd be Sunday. I go, I would guess that too. So when they come here as your volunteers on your worship team, you need to help restore their soul as Sabbath, not drive them so you have the perfect execution of your worship.
Yeah, right.
You know, again, I'm a big advocate of what we build as a DNA will either affirm our soul or bite us.
Yeah. And kind of what I'm hearing more and more as our conversation keeps going here is, I think we put so much pressure on that 1 hour on Sundays, right? We have this, our church needs to look like this and it better darn be 100% or we're not doing ministry, right? I think we've kind of turned church into something that maybe wasn't necessarily meant to be. Like, would you agree? Is that part of this too?
Yeah, I would agree that the more it becomes a set of executable programs, you know, the less it's an organic, you know, a family.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the balance. I mean, even if you are a pastor that hires people on your staff, okay, that's a terrible balance because now you have to be this employer and this family member. And, you know, how do you hold somebody to a professional team and give them the grace of a family? You know, and that's part of the challenge that you have to do. And unfortunately, what I see most people that understand that dilemma is that they change hats. Okay, now I'm going to put on the pro team hat, you know, and now I'm going to put on the family hat. And other people aren't ready to make those switches yet. And they're relating to you as family and you're relating to them as employer. And the next time they're ready to come in and you relate to you as employer and you're now your family, you know?
Yeah,
and so I think it really is the kind of thing that needs to be massaged all the time. as to what a caring relationship that can do the hard things can do. I've had to fire one of my best friends before. It was painful.
Yeah.
And for the next 2 or 3 years, I didn't have one phone conversation with him where it didn't come up. Dude, you fired me. He went, yeah, I did. Can we drop it?
Yeah. Being a pastor is just every aspect is hard, right? Like, it's a very hard job. No matter what level you are in the church, it's a very hard job. So I guess as we kind of start to wrap up here with the flourishing pastor in mind, how do you define a flourishing pastor? What are the characteristics of someone who is kind of flourishing and in a healthy position?
So I think somebody that's flourishing has a healthy identity apart from their ministry responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's somebody who is able to let someone else fail. Okay. And what I mean by that is that whether it's a pastor or a parent, sometimes our motivation for wanting to see a child behave or a congregation do well is because it makes us better. I'm a better parent if I have better kids. I'm a better pastor if I have a better church,
Sure.
And we've got to get off that connection. It's just not one-to-one, I mean, I was a youth pastor for 16 years and I had great kids with crap parents and I had crap kids with great parents. There just wasn't a one-to-one correspondence.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, I think that's a big deal. I think another thing as far as what is a flourishing pastor is somebody who, Scazzaro is the first person I heard say, and I've heard it in several places since then. They have a holy indifference. They know how to bring something that they passionately want to see happen to God with an open hand and say, if you want this, we're going forward. And if you don't, we won't, rather than I've got to have this go forward. So God bless it,
Right.
I think that's a big deal because if that is your posture, then when you really do something, you believe in God's in it, I mean, if you're doing the same thing from 15 years ago and you haven't gone through any kind of discernment process on whether or not it should be what we do today, you have no confidence God's in it.
Right. Yeah, that's good. That's important. I think that's all worth wrestling. That's so Bill, I'm sure you have, again, you're really familiar with the scriptures. You've been a pastor for a long time. Are there verses or sections of scripture that you come back to regularly that kind of help you with this?
Yeah. One I've kind of discovered while I've been working at the Center for Pastoral Flourishing, and it's Zephaniah 3:17. I know that that's on the hearts and tongues of everybody, right?
Sure.
But it says, the Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. He will take great delight in you. He will quiet you with his love. He will rejoice over you with singing.
Right.
I mean, when we can marinate in that and realize, God, I'm anxious right now. You tell me you'll quiet me with your love. God, and I feel like there isn't one person in the world that delights in me. You tell me you delight in me. That the real picture that when Nehemiah can say, the joy of the Lord is my strength, it isn't that he's going, I think God's so excited about this rickety wall I'm building. I think it was, he is excited about me leading the people of God, and Hebrews says that it was a joy that was set before him, like Christ endured the cross. So I think a good mark of a resilient leader is somebody who can recharge their joy cycles pretty quickly. Okay. Another verse that kind of comes to my mind, and this one's way more familiar to everybody, is, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer, petition with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God that transcends understanding will guard your heart and mind in Christ Jesus. I used to look at that verse and then verses in Galatians that talk about the fruit of the Spirit and think I was going to grow in those. I'm going to grow in the peace of God. I'm going to get more and more of the peace of God. And I'm going to get more joy, more love, more patience, more kindness, more faithfulness, all the 9 characteristics that are listed there in the fruit of the Spirit. But I don't think that anymore. I think that those belong to God. It says the peace of Christ will guard your heart and mind. It doesn't say he'll give it to you. He keeps it. You just get him. And the Holy Spirit keeps his fruit. You don't get it. You get him. And when he fills you, him through you is patience. Him through you is kindness. I was looking for just becoming a better Bill rather than a partnering with God Bill,
Yeah, those are great. Again, this is the danger of being in church work for too long, is those verses become familiar, right? You've heard these verses a million times, you forget how powerful they are. So yeah, thank you for sharing those with us.
Yeah, man.
Well, Bill, this has been really, really great. We could probably go a lot longer. I want to wrap up with one more question for you. So we talked at one point about how, a lot of us, we've had a long day, we're in a stressful season. We might kind of default to, oh, tonight I need to exercise, or I need to binge a show, or I need to eat a steak or whatever. Well, a lot of us kind of have one of those kind of, I don't know, kind of surfacey things that really does make us feel better. But I know that there's also, so there's those kinds of things, but then there's also the level beneath that. You mentioned, maybe it's prayer and Bible and community, or maybe there's some other, like there's probably a spiritual thing that we need even more than Netflix or exercise, right? So can you talk about that as we kind of wrap up here? I think it's probably okay. It's probably healthy to know what quote unquote surface level things will help us feel better. How do we get to that next step? And do you have any advice for sifting those things out?
Well, I think one of the things, and this is kind of like a, oh shoot type measuring rod, but if at the end of it, you don't feel any more refreshed or robust, that wasn't anything that restored your soul, Yes. So if I get through watching a series and it amped me up, that may feel like I got restored, but it probably didn't. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
And so I need to kind of almost take a soul pulse after I've done the activity that I think is going to refresh me, and evaluate whether it did. And if it didn't, then just be honest enough to go, I really enjoyed that, but it's not a restorative practice for me.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And there's legitimate places for things you enjoy that aren't restorative. I work out and it doesn't feel restorative. I work out so that I won't die.
Yep. Awesome. Well, again, this has been great. I said the last question would be the last one, but I mean it this time. So if someone wants to know more specifically about you, Bill, or for Pastoral Flourishing, or if they just need some help with this, what resources that you offer, or otherwise, what would be a good next step for people listening?
Yeah, well, they can look us up on our website at Western, and my email is bclem@westernseminary.edu. So I'd be more than happy to interact with people. I think your denomination is working hard at trying to help pastors. And I think that from what I know of you guys, it's a safe place. I don't think that if a pastor called and said, here's my struggle, that he'd lose his job.
Right. Yep.
And I think that's rare air. That's the thing that I find about our pastoral cohorts that is so life-giving to the pastors, is that it's 8 guys who may never have crossed paths before, and they can emotionally dump, they can data dump, they can do whatever they want in that group without it kind of coming back to the elder team for them,
Yeah.
And
right.
I think that keeps a lot of pastors from sharing.
Yeah.
One last thing I guess I'd like to say is that I think there's a big difference between what's a trait and what's a state. And a state is when I'm just in the moment. Okay. So I can have a fearful state. Okay. But if I stay in that fearful state, it'll become an anxiety trait.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is, it seems like something else is taking its place all the time in our culture. That's because we're developing a trait called anxiety rather than a state called fear. We were in a fearful state during COVID, but now it's becoming a trait of anxiety.
Yeah.
And so if you can see yourself in states, everybody's going to have those. They're circumstantial, but if you are letting it become a trait so that you're realizing, man, I used to criticize Barney, but now I'm criticizing Betty. I mean, if it's moved from Barney to now it's a character trait of yours,
Yeah. Gosh, I think that's just the danger of being a pastor. This has come up a couple of times. We all know what we need, right? We need help in community where we can be honest with each other, right? We need to pause our busy lives for some self-reflection to figure out what's going well, what's not. EQ stuff. I think we know all this, right? I mean, it's important, but it's just the discipline of taking time to follow up and do those next steps. I think we all could improve on.
Yeah. Well, I think the 2 biggest contributors to a hard heart in a pastor are forgetfulness. He forgets all the ways God's graced him. So I encourage people to keep some kind of grace journal where they collect the evidences of grace. And then the second thing is that I think that they become so familiar with the sacred that we assume it's going to happen.
Yep. Some Sundays keep coming, right?
Yeah.
Week after week, there's always a Sunday. Well, Bill, this has been awesome. I've really just enjoyed getting to know you. Again, we could go
Yeah, it's good to know you, man.
really important topic, but thank you for being generous with your time. Your work is so important. So thank you for doing it. Thanks for helping us out. And
I'm glad I could. You bet.
yeah, grateful for your time today. Let's talk again sometime.
All right, man. Thanks.
Do you or a loved one experience anxiety? If you've wondered what anxiety is and how to manage it, you'll want to read the March-April issue of the Christian Leader magazine. You'll also read news, stories, and columns from across our U.S. Mennonite Brethren family. Subscribe to our print magazine or read the March-April issue online at www.christianleadermag.com. Christian Leader, connecting and informing our USMB family since 1951.
Well, I so enjoyed my time with Bill. I'm so grateful for his ministry and for his heart for all of us serving in various roles in the church. And like we said at the top, this is unfortunately something that all of us need to wrestle with and all of us need to figure out for ourselves. And as Bill said, it's just so important that churches and pastors figure out a rhythm, right? And they figure out where they need to embrace their limits. And those can be hard conversations to have. And regardless of your church's size or regardless of how long you've been in ministry, those things are hard to figure out. And so I just hope and pray that Bill's tips here today have been helpful to you. I encourage you to check out the further resources that he mentioned from the Center for Pastoral Flourishing over there at Western if you want to look into some more resources, and take some time to do this because it's important. We need healthy leaders and we need healthy churches. So do what you need to do to take care of yourself, take care of your family. Your church is going to be okay. All right, well, on that note, thank you again so much for listening today. I hope you and your church, your ministry, your family, I hope you're all doing well as springtime is arriving. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and we'll catch you next time here on the Lead Pods.
Thanks for listening to Lead Pods. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing to our show wherever you're listening today. Learn more by visiting usmb.org. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll see you next time as we learn more practical tools to increase our impact together.